I signed for the key ring with rotor wash in my face and the wind trying to take my cap. The chopper dwindled to a toy and then to nothing. The platform went back to its language. Steel ticking, a slow elastic boing when a swell shouldered the legs, railings singing under gusts. The air had that dockyard breath I know too well, oil and metal baked into salt. Caretaker, they said. Keep the pumps honest. Keep the generators fed. Answer the radio if a pleasure boat drifted off course. Nobody mentioned the welded door. Tank Bay 6 waited at the end of a catwalk. A slab with heat ripples frozen in and a restricted placard blistered from some old fire. Salt had grown a white rime along the gasket like frost. Half a company's sunburst still ghosted under scrape marks. The rest had rusted to scab. When the wind shifted, the seam let go a dry hiss, the sound a valve makes when it never quite seats. I walked my first loop with a clipboard that still carried someone else's initials. Habit, palm the rail and feel the hum. Listen for the wrong note. An inline gauge on line B sat 1 psi off the panel reading. Enough to make you check fittings, not enough to make anyone on shore care. The last plant called me a troublemaker for logging things like that. Cutting my hours was easier than fixing pipe. I left before they could make it official. Ground answered on the second call. Cross on deck, I said. You stick to the protocols and you'll be fine, Miss Ortega said, voice like a memo. Incident in 87 is not pertinent to current operations. What was the data loss, she said, clean and final. Log your rounds, Mr. Cross. I said all good and stared at my boots while I said it. I lie small, always have. Keeps the world moving past you. 2 gulls rode the slipstream over the flare and sheared hard when the wind veered. Silhouettes gone like they'd thought better of it. Far west, thunderheads stacked on the horizon, gray like folded lead. Between the legs of the platform, the water threw a thin rainbow where the light hit a slick just right. On 16, the VHF popped, carrier noise and a thin voice a long way off. Kids on the water? Probably a chewed-up call sign. I wrote the time anyway. Alone makes you tidy. By 2300, the platform had settled into its night noises. Generators droned, relays clicked, vent stacks gave those crisp, neat exhales, salt crusted the lamp rims. Every bulb wore a tea-stained halo. I checked the off-by-1 gauge again, mostly to touch something I could fix. I looked at my watch without meaning to. 22:57. Not 3:17. Not yet. I passed base 6 and made a show of not looking. The seam breathed a smell that didn't belong outdoors, clean and brittle, like the first strike of a welder's arc across plate. Not diesel, not rot. Then the light came, blue-white, knife-edged, a strip as thin as a playing card under the door, not a flare, not some idiot's flashlight. One pulse, long enough to etch itself into my retina. The air at my face went colder when it happened, not warmer. My molars ached the way they do slah when ice water finds a crack. I held the clipboard against my chest like a shield and listened to my breathing until a loose cable slapped a stanchion above and gave my hands something else to blame for shaking. I slept with the light on. Or I left it on by accident. The bunk frame thrummed when a swell hit square. I ran the numbers I always run. How much I owe, how long I can pretend not to, how many unknown calls I can ignore before somebody shows up at my sister's door. They never add up. They just go quiet. Morning came in flat Gulf gray that turned sea and sky into one sheet of steel. Coffee tasted like burned pennies, but it was hot, and it put something back in my fingers. I was crossing to the radio room when I saw the folder on the console. Manila, chalk dry. Winter protocol stamped crooked in faded government blue. 7 pages, legal pad torn rough. The handwriting leaned right and jittered like the wind was trying to take the sheet. I read rule number 1 twice before I realized I was clenching my jaw. Rule number 1, do not enter Tank Bay 6 after night shift. If you see lights inside, do not investigate. Call Miss Ortega immediately. 3 underlines on immediately. The last pass nearly cutting the paper through. I had already stood there and admired the light. The next rule set my clock. Rule number 2, at 3:17, count observation windows at each bay, 6 panes per bay. If you count 7 or more, retreat to the control room and wait for daylight. No commentary, no why. Rule number 3 told me what to say if anyone reported children after 2200, machinery resonance, not voices. Rule number 4 named a woman in a yellow protective suit who would ask for the lifeboat stairs between December 15 and March 1. Point her to open water. Do not assist, do not follow. She has been dead since 1987. I felt the platform through my boots. Minute changes in how the deck carried weight when the swell changed, period. Outside, a gull yammered once and went quiet. A relay knocked behind me, and my head came around like it had said my name. The last page was a different pen, darker, steadier. The occupants of Bay 6 do not eat. They do not sleep. They do not feel cold. They remember being alive. Keep them fed with respect and distance. What they want most is what you cannot give them. Heat, not warmth. Heat. Numbers on a gauge you can move with valves. Versus the other thing, the hand on your shoulder when somebody's glad you came home. I slid the pages into the inside pocket of my coveralls. The zipper tab clicked and settled against my sternum like a spare bone. Wind freshened. The hull gave a patient boing that came up through my shins. I took the catwalk because my legs do that when my head stalls. The restricted placard flapped on its one good rivet. Salt had built the gasket edge into a white scab. The blue-white flashed again, nearer, not brighter. A crisp lick under the seam that raised the hair on my wrist. I didn't call Ortega. I counted the placard screws. 6. I told myself that meant something good. Turned away with 7 pages warm against my ribs. And Bay 6 gave a long, thin breath through the seam like a ballast tank equalizing after a hard slam. I set my alarm for 3:10 and woke at 3:06. The platform at that hour felt like the inside of a lung. Shh, between breaths. I dressed without the overhead, thumbed the inside pocket to feel the rasp of paper. 7 rules on my ribs, like a spare bone. Rule number 2, set the clock. 3:17, count observation windows, 6 per bay. 7 or more, retreat and wait for daylight. Luis had come on the afternoon hop. Clean laminate badge, webbing still shiny. Environmental engineer, temporary assignment. He asked to shadow a graveyard pass to learn the place. I told him he could if he didn't touch valves. He smiled like I'd passed a test and produced an instant camera. Film never lies, he said. I didn't bother with all the times it had. We stepped onto the ring at 3:14, headlamps low. Breath went out as pale ghosts flattened in the crosswind. Vent stacks sighed. The deck gave that damped boing you feel more than hear. Below the grating, something rolled once in the lee of the legs, a brief smear of green phosphorescence, and gone. Bay 1 and 2 were quick, 6 panes each, glass cold to the knuckle. Nothing to note. Bay 3 tightened with a small catch as the pane shrank a hair with the cold. Just physics. Bay 4 and 5, 6 and 6. We moved like hands on a clock, falling into the platform's habit without meaning to. I looked at my watch without wanting to. 3:17, quiet blue. The control room has its own row of viewing bricks set in steel. Thick glass you can lean your forehead to and let the cold crawl in. I stood square and counted left to right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. My eyes did their tired micro skip, sideways, a little jump I've had since a bad ferry watch. And then there was another pane where bare steel should be. Not bright, not new. There the way a bruise is there. You don't notice until pressure finds it. On the inside, a circle of fog bloomed and faded, then bloomed again. The rhythm wasn't the platform's. I realized I was matching it. Inhale, bloom, exhale, fade. I pulled back. The fog stayed with me 2 more beats, like we were still tied by a thin elastic I couldn't see. 6, Luis said, easy. You good? Count again, I said, and heard my voice land wrong. He leaned in, tapped 1 knuckle, hissed at the temperature. 6. Want a picture? He took one anyway. The camera chirred and spat a square to Matt, chemical milk hiding whatever truth it planned to keep. While it cooked, the 7th pane made a second circle. Smaller, as if a smaller mouth had breathed. 5 short fingers pressed out of the fog and spread. Not real prints, no whorls, no ridges, just chalk rubbed thin. Do you see that? I asked, not pointing. Pointing felt like naming. See what? He was tapping the picture with a fingernail. Pareidolia, he said, pleased with the word. Brains are pattern engines. Parallax in these bricks is garbage. Thick glass, off-axis light, condensation, plus fatigue. The fog hand flattened like weight leaned in. Then it was gone, between one breath and the next. I didn't feel scared so much as recognized the way you feel when a collector uses your middle names at a door you shouldn't be sleeping behind. Heat versus warmth, I thought. This wasn't either. This was pressure on a membrane, testing for give. He pushed the photo into my hand. 6 black rectangles, neat as math. No 7th, no fog. Let's call it 6, he said, and sleep. I put the photo against the glass and matched corners. Paper 6 sat where glass 6 sat, and the 7th occupied the place the photo left blank. The seam between what my eyes said and what the picture said crawled up my nerves. The pain gave another catch, the little contraction sound that usually calms me because it belongs to steel. This time it felt like a reply. I needed a task that wasn't watching myself be wrong. The old procedure binder lives under the console. A fossil of before the rebrand. I slid it out, pages salted and stuck, flipped till a stapled sheet fell open. Inspection notes, winterize. A line read, window parallax, condensation artifacts noted during cold starts, see memo. Someone had blacked out parallax condensation with a thick marker. A later pencil had put a check mark beside the line staff, then erased it until the paper thinned. Artifact, Luis repeated, reading upside down. See? I closed the binder. Thin spots make me think about other thin spots. You ever had something look right at you? I asked. It came out smaller than I meant. Luis glanced at me, then at the panes. Sure. Dear. Night shift. My ex. Still your brain arranging facts it already owns. The 7th breathed with me again, bloom, fade, and left nothing the camera could keep. I wasn't mad at him, so I was mad at the part of me that wanted him to certify my sanity. 6, I said, and wrote it, because the form has a box for 6 and not for the other thing. My palm left a salt print that dried to white. On the way out, I did the dog and window thing. I set my fingertips to the 7th to prove there was glass. The cold took the sweat from my skin so fast it clicked in my bones. I should have pulled away. Instead, I held one beat longer. 1, 2. Because some stupid, honest place in me wanted to know if anything on the other side could feel me back. A smaller handprint rose inside. Palm to palm through inches of glass. My hand tightened instead of letting go. When I finally pulled free, the fog followed, elastic for a beat, then snapped to plain dark. Pareidolia, Luis said again, but without much air. He lifted the camera and shot. The square whined out. 6 rectangles, tidy as ever. I slipped the photo with the rules. We stepped onto the catwalk. The platform gave a careful boing. A vent line exhaled like it had been holding its breath to see which way we'd vote. Under the grating, the water rolled once, just a darker dark, and decided, wisely, not to get involved. Luis unpacked fast, the way people do when they're excited. Hard case open. Fleer on the rail. Panhead on a tripod that bit into the grating. No show and tell about foam cutouts this time, just cables, a loop of tape. His hands moving like he'd rehearsed it on land. I stood with my pockets turned warm and watched the wind draw a white seam along the tops of the waves. Thermal field study, he said, bright. Baseline now. Anomalies tonight. Anywhere but on 6, I said. Opposite the door, from the catwalk. We won't touch a valve. He said it like you talk to a skittish dog. If it's parallax, we'll catch it. If it's something else, data doesn't spook. The auxiliary thruster kicked once to hold heading. It gave that ray bearing grit whine that lives in your jaw before your ear. Air up here dries you from the inside. Hydrocarbons hang invisible. They make your tongue feel wiped with a shop rag. By the time he had the fixed unit up, my throat felt like paper. We mounted one Fleer 20 feet downscope of Bay 6 across the welded seam. The panhead went on the opposite run, set to a slow sweep, 30 left, 30 right. The displays walked from afternoon oranges to layered blues. Deck steel held warm where sun had kissed it. Shadows slumped into navy. My body showed as a yellow smear from chest up, duller at the hands where wind ate me. Ambience collapsing at the seam, Luis said, tapping the corner graph. He rubbed salt off the screen with his thumb, then noticed and wiped his thumb on his pants. Look at the gradient. Not hotter, not colder. It's nothing. Null, I said. The word felt like a hole. On my way past the drain channel by the Bay 6 door, something pale in the grate caught light. I crouched, teased it out with a bent zip tie, a sea-scoured plastic name tag, the print half-ghosted but legible. Vargas E., slick with old salt. I set it on the console to dry and pretended it wasn't looking back. We left the rigs running through dusk. A deckhand from the supply hop poked his head in for a crescent wrench. He nodded at the screens and said, "Only thing uglier than a storm is a man measuring it." Then he left. When the wind came around, the flare breathed red and steady. The platform pulled its shoulders tight. The Fleer cooled to blues. At 2110, the fixed unit drew 7 holes on the rail above Bay 6. Not hot, Not cold, less than cold, like you'd cut the picture with a razor and let night bleed through. The panhead picked them from the side. Small, spaced with the kind of discipline kids have when an adult says, stand still. Toes turned a touch in, weight on the outer edge of each foot. Noise? I asked, hoping. If it's noise, Luis said, it's synchronized across 2 cameras and a wind shift. He leaned in with that bounce you get when you can smell a paper and a raise. Negative space registering as energy loss. 10 minutes closer. No. From the catwalk above, he bargained. Clipped in, same angle. The thruster complained, ray, and the needle on the cheap analog thermometer dropped like a flicked eyelash. The skin over my wrists went thin and brittle. I rubbed my hands together and got no sound. 2 minutes, I said, hating the part of me that wants to know. He clipped into the upper run. Belly slid until he was over their heads by a lane. The pan head kept sweeping. Each pass, the 7 returned as clean holes in the picture. Luis raised his phone for a visible shot to match the fleur. They looked up together. You don't expect coordination from things you haven't agreed are there. In the fixed frame, 7 nulls tilted the same degree in the same tick. Like someone had given a quiet order. Faces were nothing on thermal. 2 colder circles where eyes should be, and each circle wore a faint rim of not quite warm. A shimmering ring like corona discharge where cold and less cold argue. On the phone image, only rail and night. My skin crawled at how both could be true. It's responding, Luis whispered, delighted. See that halo? I see you coming down, I said. Now. My voice had gone small in my own ear. Luis stayed 1 heartbeat too long. The 7 lifted their heads a hair more. Halos brightening, like something on the far side leaned closer to its own glass. Down, I said, sharper. He slid back, boots scuffing rust that peppered the fixed lens. The 7 didn't follow him. They turned. No shoe scrape. No rebalancing weight. Heads rotated right in the same degree at the same time, as if tracking a parade cresting the horizon. The line they traced intersected nothing out on the water. The horizon stayed iron flat, refusing to carry whatever they were watching. The line ran through the bulkhead at my left shoulder and kept going through steel and air into the inside radius of the platform, where crew quarters sit like beads on a ring, right through my bunk. The camera timestamp stuttered, as if it had blinked. I took 2 involuntary steps, hand finding the console edge. The paper in my pocket felt bright against my ribs, like it had heated. It reminded me of letters that find you no matter where you go. The way a collector will get your name right at a new address before your friends do. Okay, Luis said, hearing it now. Okay, I wanted the cameras gone. I wanted to chew the zip ties and throw the rigs over the rail. Kill the pan, I said. Kill the fixed. We do not feed this. Data. We're not feeding data. We're feeding attention. He reached for the switch with a look that promised an argument later. In the half second before the screens went black, the 7 finished their turn. The halos around their black eyes steadied to thin rings. Saints in the wrong religion. They weren't looking at the camera anymore. They were looking through it, past us, at the warmed rectangle where I sleep, and I understood how you can make a room colder without moving 1 molecule of air. The first report came from 2 deckhands coming off the aft catwalk at 2211, boots ringing diesel onto the mat. You got kids on here? One asked. Half a laugh under it to make it safe. No, I said. Rule pages warmed my ribs through the coveralls, like a heating pad I hadn't asked for. Sounded like nursery nonsense, the other tried. Hands open. By the tank legs, little voices. Pump resonance in the manifold, I said before he could gift the thing a name. Lines sing when the tide swings, harmless. I kept my voice flat like I was explaining a gasket. They looked relieved to be told something simple and left with their relief like a thing paid for. The radio room felt smaller at night. Neon hummed. The console put off a low, familiar warmth. Dust and salt made a thin sugar on the metal. I logged the complaint because alone makes you tidy. I turned a few pages back, looking for precedents. An old hand had left pencil notes in the margins the winter before the rebrand, ticks and curses and 1 line under a timestamp. Answer your name equals cold in lungs. Someone had tried to erase it and torn the paper thin. Luis came in with a small recorder and the grin of someone with a working theory. If there's a signal, we'll capture it at the source, he said, laying the device by the base set. We'll need a clean noise floor. Kill the room fan? No experiments, I said. If you hear something after 2200, you do not answer. That's not answering, he said, already peeling tape to mount a contact mic. That's listening. The back door popped its latch at 22:28. A gentle open close as if someone had forgotten to catch it. Wind pushed damp into the room, made the paper on my clipboard lift and settle. Somewhere outside, steel boomed the way it does when a swell hits square. One slow boing that works from hull to teeth. The first line came in thin like a whistle far down a pipe. A child's high register, just a note below sweet. Ring around the rosy. I saw the deck in my head, salt glossing the paint to ice, oil making a thin dark that would put a man on his back if he hurried. I didn't go stand in it. I stayed with the rule. Machinery resonance, I said to the empty room, as much for me as for anyone. The recorder picked at the silence like a mouse, pocket full of posies. The base set was off, breaker open, handset cradled. The VU meter sat at its left stop, the needle asleep against the peg. In the glass, I could see my own breath make small crescents. Then the speaker grill breathed in, not out. You could see the air gather around it, the way cold pulls a curtain of moisture onto the nearest surface. A soft hiss rose from the box, like a man with an oxygen mask getting the first trickle. Ethan, said the hiss. My name. Careful as a teacher on day one. Come play. Luis went very still. That's room tone, I said. I heard myself try to laugh, and it sounded like I hadn't used the muscles in months. He reached for the handset. We can answer on a dead set and see if... I slapped his hand without thinking. No, he stared at me, then at the breaker. Genuinely puzzled, like I had hidden a second switch in my sleeve. The hiss shaped itself again with patience. Ethan, it said, testing the syllables as if the name were a piece of candy you have to work with your tongue. It wasn't just young. It had the polite cadence of old tape, and the breathless timbre of something that doesn't actually breathe. My chest pinched as if someone wrenched a belt around it 2 holes tighter. Rule number 3. If guests report children after 2200, it's wildlife. Rule number 5. Do not acknowledge voices after 2200. Do not answer if they call your name. They know your name. Machinery, I said, but the word hit the inside of my mouth wrong and slid off. Luis lifted the handset again, slower, like not to startle a bird. Just say hello, he whispered. For the record, it's evidence. The tip of the antenna had a ring of dew on it, budded like a plant at dawn. I took the handset from him, meaning to move it out of reach. The plastic was so cold the sweat left my palm with an audible stick. I held it near my mouth because some stupid part of me wanted the posture of control. Ye, I said, and the letter cratered. It felt like inhaling off dry ice. Cold flowered down my throat and into the top of my lungs, and kept going. A slow pour that didn't stop at the branches. I couldn't get the next syllable up. The VU needle, on an unpowered set, twitched off its peg. It crept past -10 dB like a compass reluctantly finding north. Condensation filmed the inside of the meter glass backwards, as if it were frosting from within the panel toward us. My breath came short and sharp, like each inhale broke something. I hung the handset the way you put down a knife you found in your own hand. No, I said, to Luis, to the recorder, to the room. We do not feed this. The hiss gentled itself. We know you have the rules, it said, like sharing a secret you both should be proud of. We know you're listening. I reached behind the rack and yanked the power cable out of the wall because ritual helps even if physics doesn't. The plug came free with the small spark you get when you kill a live load. The hiss stayed. Sibilant. Pleased. The VU needle dipped another hair below zero and held there, like a diver taking their sweet time at depth. Machinery, I told the clipboard, pen squeaking. My handwriting came out smaller than usual and leaned the wrong way. On the margin of an old page, the faint torn words waited, answer your name equals cold in lungs. Luis had the recorder tight against his chest. Just once, he said, soft. Say hello and let me. I shook my head. It took effort. My neck felt packed with snow. Rule number 5, I said, we do not answer. The hiss didn't get angry. It began to hum, off-key, searching for whatever tune I would know. Ashes, ashes. It waited for the endpoint like a child who wants to say it in chorus. When I didn't give it, the sound thinned until there was only room tone, and the neon hum and the tin taste the cold leaves after it goes. We sat that way for a minute or for a year. The meter needle stayed below zero a breath longer, then slid back until it kissed the peg. The glass over it held a perfect oval of fog, thumbprint size. It faded from the center out. On the mat at the door, oily footprints I hadn't made went partway into the hall. They stopped where the wind could not have dried them. I didn't follow. I logged the time and the weather and wrote, "No response," because that's the shape the rule gives you. Then I put my hand flat on my sternum and waited for the ache to stop, feeling like I'd breathed winter into the warmest part of me. She was already there when the flare's red sweep came around again, standing at the starboard rail with both hands on the pipe like a tourist who'd picked the wrong pier. Yellow suit, old pattern. The fabric had that waxy look you get before polymers crack. The reflective chevrons across the chest caught the flare and threw it back. Wrong. 7 degrees off the path light should take. Like a mirror mounted crooked inside her. Wind searched the cables and made a thin flute. A low-pressure lamp winked once on a manifold panel and went back to sleep. The kind of nuisance alarm you log and ignore if you want to keep friends. Salt had chewed a lace of white around the fixture rims. Every bulb wore a tired halo. Luis lifted his phone without meaning to. "Visible first," he whispered, taking a step. I hooked a finger in his harness and kept him beside me. Rule number 4 sat in my pocket like a hot coin. The woman in the yellow protective suit will ask for the lifeboat stairs between December 15th and March 1st. Point. Do not assist. Do not follow. She has been dead since 1987. She turned her head toward us. The faceplate was up. The hood gaped around a scalp-dark shadow that should have been hair, and wasn't. No breath showed. When she spoke, the wind didn't take anything from it. "Excuse me," she said, polite and patient. "Where's the lifeboat?" The voice had the clean edges of an intercom with the compressor stripped out. Even without a carrier, it sat in the air like a picture you can't unsee. It hit behind my sternum where the radio voice had left a bruise. I kept my hands at my sides and pointed with my chin. "Follow the rail to the green exit," I said. "Starboard embarkation ladder. Keep going till you see the glow sticks by the davit." "Thank you." Her head tipped in a small nod. The chevrons threw the flares red again at the wrong angle like a sign painted once and hung in a different hallway. She put one foot forward and the sole didn't squeak on paint, didn't ring on steel. The fabric made no sound where it should rasp. "Stay," I said to Luis, as if he were a dog and I were saying it to both of us. He kept the phone up and widened his stance for a pan. "I need the wide," he whispered. "Let me pace her, 10 meters back." "Don't," I said. My fingers tightened on his harness until the webbing creaked. She walked with her hands still on the rail, sliding along like a child who'd found a rule. Where she passed, frost filmed the lamp lenses, but not from the outside. It bloomed under the glass first, a cloud trapped within the fixture, then pressed outward in a thin skin-like breath against a window, wrong direction and all. "Excuse me," she said again when she was abreast of us, as if we hadn't answered. Up close, the suit showed salt at the seams and a square imprint on the chest where a name patch once rode. I thought of the tag I'd fished from the drain earlier. Vargas E. A shape like a hand had stretched the collar out long ago and never quite let it spring back. She turned her face toward mine from 3 feet away. The sense that something ought to fog, ought to condense, came and didn't land. "Is the sea rough?" she asked, conversational. Like we were in a foyer and she'd set her purse down somewhere wrong. "Follow the rail," I said. "Watch your step." It felt obscene to tell something that didn't weigh anything to watch for traction. The low-pressure lamp winked twice and stayed off. Luis shifted an inch to keep her centered in frame. The flare breathed red and steady. The reflection in her chevron slid sideways against physics. I told myself I wasn't shivering. The starboard door to the accommodation block had a glass panel at eye height. As she passed it, my eyes did the human thing. Looked for us in the reflection to keep my bearings. I saw yellow behind my own shoulder. I turned too fast and banged my elbow on the jamb. The catwalk was empty in the angle where the glass said she stood. In the reflection, she waited politely at my back. The reflective strip across her chest floating 7 degrees off the flare's bar of red. Like 2 instruments trying to play the same note in different tunings. "Ethan," she said to the glass version of me. It didn't sound like a question this time. I didn't turn back to meet the reflection. I stared at the actual catwalk where nothing stood and made my voice do the helpful thing. Green exit, I said. Embarkation ladder. Do not. I swallowed the last word before it could be fall or follow. Stop. Keep going. Luis breathed in a laugh he couldn't use and choked on it. We can get her boots, he said, half to himself. Footfalls. Weight. Sound. There isn't any, I said. My mouth had gone dry in the way methane does it to you when you work a line too long without a mask. You can't record missing. She continued along the rail until the flare's red sweep put her in silhouette. In that backlight, the chevrons gave a second, ghostly reflection slid to the side, like two suits sharing a body. She reached the green exit and didn't look at it. Instead, she paused where the ladder's cage begins, where a living person reaches for the first rung and knows in their knees that it's going to tilt them over black water. Is it cold? She asked the ladder, as if it might answer. Her posture suggested a conversation with an empty bed. It's winter, I said, because a lie works better when it's almost true. Keep to the rail. She took the first step. The ladder didn't speak. The little belly in your ear that hears metal load never heard anything. I didn't follow. I counted 3 breaths, then backed us through the starboard door and put steel between us and the view. My hands shook on the latch. The handle left a cold shadow in my palm. The gear locker was 2 doors down. Inside, suits hung in a sad yellow row, salt stiffening the creases. One hook was empty except for a torn elastic where a hood should have hung. A paper tag wired to the rail had a name scoured down to its first letter and a hyphen. E. The fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, and for a second, the reflective tape on the suits lifted a dull glow on its own, not catching anything, just deciding to be seen. Helmet missing, Luis said, as if taking inventory for a report we'd never file. Point. Do not assist. Do not follow, I said. Saying it made it truer, the way repeating a password makes a door recognize you. The wind ran a cable outside, and the platform answered with a patient boing that said, "We can hold as long as you don't let anything else in." Luis came into the control room after lunch with a folded thing that looked like it had spent a decade under a toolbox. "Found this in the cable tray by the old printer," he said, laying it flat with the care you give brittle skin. Newsprint gone the color of tea. Deck, 1987. Offshore incident. 5 dead, 2 missing. The column ran long, then cut off where a mouse had eaten the corner. The names listed under dead were clean. Under missing, a surname and a first initial blurred out into bad ink and moisture. A smudge where a hyphen might have been. Vargas? I asked without wanting to. Eyes already finding the E. Could be any E, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He tapped the masthead. The company had a different name then. The old logo, the one partially sanded off the Bay 6 door. Records from that winter are Swiss cheese, he said, too bright. We could call Ortega and ask why. We did. Her voice came in clean and dry on sat phone, the way air-conditioned offices sound even when miles of water sit between you. Legacy Archive suffered a flood event during warehouse consolidation, she said, like reading a card. You have the protocols. Follow them and do not improvise. We're in a weather window and helicopter support is thin. No excursions. No media. What about names? Luis asked. What about the missing? Data loss does not change operating reality, Ortega said, and the line clicked as if someone had set a pen down near a microphone. Stick to the rules. She hung up politely without saying goodbye. The platform's quiet had a way of turning on its side and becoming a different quiet when something shifted. The way a sleeping dog will change the weight of the room without moving more than an ear. At 15:04, I heard it. Cook, cook. Not pipe contraction. Not a loose line. 3 patient knocks from the direction of Bay 6, spaced like someone could wait all day. Luis stopped with his finger still marking the place on the paper and looked at me like I'd dropped something. We were on our feet before we decided to be. On the catwalk, winter sun had no interest in us. The seam around Bay 6 wore its bead of weld like a closed eye. Cook. Then quiet. The relay bank in the pump room next door started a lazy tic-tac that didn't match any schedule, like bored fingers on a desk. 2 pressure gauges in separate panels, loops that don't talk to each other, began to tremble in unison. A little quiver around nominal that made the needles nod together as if agreeing on a point no one in this world had made. You seeing that? Luis breathed. They're not connected, I said, and hated how much sound my voice put into air that didn't want it. The smell landed next. Singed paint the way it smells when you aim a heat gun too long. And under that, a clean slice of ozone like a plug that has arced behind drywall. My teeth wanted to set together. The steel rail felt colder than itself, numb that bites back. We rounded the bay. The first print was waist height on the outer skin. Long fingers splayed as if to catch balance or greet. At first, I took it for grease. Then the light shifted, and it had the matte of carbon, not oil. You could see ridges where none should have been. No human whorl. Just strata like charcoal rubbed along grain. In the center of the palm, a dark bud the size of a coin. And from that bud, petal shapes of soot blooming outward one after the other. 5, then 7, thin as ash. It's growing, Luis said, wonder cutting his voice thinner. He lifted his phone, realized what that would mean, and lowered it again. Step back, I said. My thumb found the rule page through my coveralls like a rosary. Keep them fed with respect and distance. The word fed made my mouth dry as methane line work. We're not opening anything. Not opening, he said, already rationalizing. Just a controlled pressure relief. Crack the seam a hair above ambient, see if the flow is into or out of... No. The relay bank tick-tacked. The gauges nodded. Coke came again, closer this time, like knuckles lightly trying the thickness between. He gestured at the condensate line that ran past the door. A string of droplets had been crawling along it, fattening and falling onto the drip tray all morning. Now the closest drop to the seam stopped forming its bead. It thinned, reached back upstream like a hand feeling in the dark, and drew itself backward along the underside of the pipe toward the door. The next drop did the same. Tiny reversing rivulets crept uphill, against gravity, against habit, against me. Convection, Luis whispered, as if naming it could domesticate it. Aura. He didn't finish the word gradient because the pressure gauges hiccuped together and sat an eyebrow higher than they had a second before. On the bay skin, another print laid itself down beside the first. Smaller hand, maybe. The soot flower bloomed faster in that one. Bud, then petals, then a thin black flare along each fingertip as if fingernails had been drawn with a charcoal pencil and then smudged. The air near the prints felt weirdly motionless and thinner than outside that patch, like heat had been pulled so clean out of 1 square foot, it had changed the way the square foot let molecules touch. Luis? I said. Back. His hand had drifted toward the seam like people drift toward cliff edges just to look. He didn't touch it, but his breath shortened a notch, like his body understood what his head wanted to ignore. If we vent a millimeter, he tried again, they might stop hunting. They're not hunting, I said. They're asking. That's worse. We stood there, taking turns, not moving toward the door. The condensate reversed itself along another elbow and fed into the seam like a thread feeds into a needle's eye. The relay bank knocked a polite rhythm nobody had taught it. The chewed headline in my pocket turned heavier inside my head. People whose names don't make lists still want to be counted. Debts don't go away when the server loses invoices. They just come to your new address carrying their own copies. The third handprint slid into being lower, arm's length from a child's reach. The petals of soot came fast now, overlapping. Black on black until the thing looked less like a hand and more like a bloom pressed in a book and left for a winter too long. When the air shifted a little, the soot didn't drift, it adhered. The center bud went glossy for a second as if some liquid had touched from the other side and then pulled back. Okay, Luis said, voice scratched thin. We go and pretend we didn't see that. We saw it, I said, because the platform has rules about lies as well. We write it, and we brace the hinges. That's what we do. We backed away, my palm left sweat on the rail that the wind couldn't find. Behind us, the relay bank ticked twice in quick succession and then held still, like fingers deciding they'd made their point. The gauges eased back to nominal in the same heartbeat, still perfectly together. The scent of burned paint lingered. The flowers of soot on the skin of Bay 6 sat black and new and patient. I logged the time and wrote, carbon transfer at exterior, apparent inward draw on condensate, because there wasn't a box for 3 small hands knocking because they remember being warm. When I capped the pen, the knock came once more, and then waited in a silence so polite it chilled me worse than any wind could. I set an alarm for 12:30 and lay on top of the blanket anyway. Boots off. Jacket zipped to the notch where the zipper tab clicks against my sternum like a spare bone. The bunk metal ticked as it gave its day heat to the air. The vent above the door exhaled a tired ribbon and then thought better of it. Thermometer by the mirror said 61 degrees Fahrenheit when I closed my eyes. When it went off half an hour later, it said 46 and dropping. Frost had pushed a lace along the hem of the sheet, each tooth pointing inward as if the cold were coming from the mattress up. When I blew across the lace, it didn't move. The room had that quiet you get when a storm passes 40 miles away and all the pressure wants to hold still. I could feel the rule pages through the coveralls where I'd shoved them under my shirt, a warm bandage over a bad idea, just a little. It was not a voice so much as several mouths thinking the same word close to the wall. Hard to put a direction on. It found the bit of me where names sit. It did not use mine. That almost made it worse. My plan was small and stupid. A controlled violation. If giving a little took their attention off the hinges and off the crew, maybe we could buy quiet while we figured out the rest. Rule number 7 had the word fed in it. Everything on a platform is about budget. Electrical, fuel, time. This would be a heat budget on my terms. I set my watch to count seconds. I rolled onto my side, pulled the blanket tight under my chin, and freed my right wrist into the air. The skin went raw cold in the half-inch between cloth and night the way dry ice goes through cotton. I held the pose and kept my mouth shut. The first touch wasn't a touch, it was absence. The skin over the radial artery hollowed with a sensation like something drawing with a straw. Frost wrote itself outward from the pulse point in ferny lines, a map sprinting along capillaries toward the base of my thumb. The pain came late and immediate, a bright sting that felt exactly like heat under a soldering iron, except it wasn't heat. It was the same null the Fleur had shown. Less than cold, 10 seconds. 12. I counted the way you count in a dentist chair. At 14, my heartbeat stumbled and then found a slower track. Like a metronome, someone thumbed down a notch. The air around my wrist felt thinner, as if breathing had to make a choice and lungs were secondary tonight. Something shifted at the foot of the bed. Not weight, precisely. No coil spring spoke. But the blanket bowed inward the way fabric does over a knee. A second depression took shape by my hip, small and careful, the way a child sits without permission. I kept staring at the metal seam where wall meets ceiling and swallowed against the reflex to say hello. The window over the desk showed nothing but my own dim outline and the flare's distant red. On the glass, 7 little ovals of fog blinked into being at the same time, the size of eyes. Each had a slim rim, not warm, not lit, just a faint disagreement with the pain that made a corona. The ovals didn't move closer. They watched my wrist. Just a little, the room said again, pleased as if I had proven I could follow directions. 19, 20. My thumb tingled in a pattern that matched my pulse, and then stopped matching. I pulled back. The pain followed my hand inside like a dog too big for the doorway. White numbness took the skin in a crisp oval. When I tapped the spot with a fingernail, it made no sound I could hear. I shoved both hands into my armpits and kept them there. The 7 ovals on the glass thinned and went. The 2 dips on the blanket lifted back toward nobody. "You're out of your mind," Luis said from the doorway. Whispered, because he still thought the night should be treated like a sleeping thing. He hadn't knocked. The latch hadn't given him away. His headlamp was around his neck and off. His breath showed and broke. "You fed them." "A little," I said, or thought I did. My voice came powder dry. "I set a limit." "That's not how limits work with mouths," he said, eyes on my wrist. He didn't step into the room. The threshold had more meaning than wood. 2 minutes later, the shivers hit. Not the theatrical ones you can fake to get a blanket, but the big ones. Deep. Involuntary. Full-body shakes that rattle your eyes. Afterdrop rides on the back of the first relief. Warm blood returns from cold limbs and drags colder with it. My chest felt like the radio moment, belt 2 holes tighter from the inside. I sat up fast and immediately wanted not to. The world tipped 3 degrees and then tipped back. My teeth did a small, neat chatter like relay contacts. Luis flinched at the sound and finally came in. He had a thermos and a towel he must have stolen from the galley. He wrapped the towel hard around my forearm and held it there with both hands, like a tourniquet for a ghost wound. 30 seconds? 60? How long? 19, I said. Maybe 20. Counting goes weird when you're the thing being measured. Jesus, he said, and then lower to himself. Publication ethics, my ass. Over his shoulder, the room gathered itself into shape again. Not human shape. Budget shape. That sense of a ledger adding columns in the dark. Something had tasted the math and liked it. The vents stayed still. The thermometer slid one more notch down. The window glass slicked and dried in pulses, as if a small choir was practicing breath control on the other side. When the worst of the shakes eased, I took the towel off. The skin at the wrist had colored back, pink around a white coin where the pulse runs shallow. Frost nip, not frostbite. Sensation returned in needles. My watch had fogged under its face from the inside and then cleared from the center out. My stomach lurched the way it does after a hard ladder climb, vagal, ugly, gone. I know, I said before he told me. I won't do it like that again. You won't do it at all, he said, but his eyes were hunting the room like a man who already knew that wasn't true. I opened the drawer for a pen to log the time and found a sticky note folded small and shoved to the back. The paper had gone brittle. The ink spidered. Give a little and they talk. Give a lot, and the line broke where the corner had torn off. The word stay was readable. The rest was a smear like weather. I wrote, controlled feed, 19 to 20 seconds, wrist, immediate Brady, after drop, 3 to 5 minutes. Frostnip. Because there wasn't a standardized way to say we paid and the price fit in a hand. Outside, something small drummed once on the door with the patience of yesterday's knock and then didn't bother again. I called for an evacuation at 10:06. I didn't dress it up. We have physical manifestations at base 6, I said into the SAT handset, standing in the radio room because old habits point you to the room with the maps when you mean to ask for mercy. Marks on the skin, reverse condensate, rule number 5 events on an unpowered set. We need people off. Ortega's line came back clean and arid, like air from a vent that never learned humidity. Copy site distress, she said, paper moving somewhere near her mic. Weather window is marginal. We can't fly a full lift tonight. Any lift, I said, one net at a time. Start it. A pause that wasn't static. Calculations, probably. We'll reduce non-critical load and accommodations, she said. Keep heat priority on technical spaces, pump rooms, power, control. You know the drill. Close radiators and berths. Inconvenient, but survivable. Turning the crew quarters cold is not survivable if the thing that eats cold is awake, I said. My throat felt like methane line work again. Dry, tasted of metal. You're proposing to pull warmth out of the only places we can wrap bodies up. Your task is to preserve plant, she said. I see your notes. You've proven attention is a resource. Don't feed it. Minimize exposure. We'll keep you in diesel, but I can't waste BTUs on empty bunks. They're not empty. She let that sit. Follow the protocols, she said finally, softer. They're designed to keep people safe until spring. You mean they're designed to keep the site open until spring. Operational reality does not change because the archive took water, she said, and the phrase walked me right back to the 1987 clippings in my pocket. We'll reassess at 3:30. Her words ran out against a faint other sound that didn't belong to bandwidth or office air. I heard it before I decided to, a breathless chorus faint as the hiss from an oxygen mask. It lapped the edges of her syllables the way Tide fingers barnacles. If I watched the VU meter on the dead base set, the needle didn't move. Still, something in the room leaned toward the handset. We'll keep you in diesel, Ortega said. Feed them, said the same cadence in the same place, with none of the air the living spend to talk. I did not acknowledge. I took the mouthpiece away from my face and watched frost draft in an oval on the plastic like a word trying to write itself backward. We need a boat on standby, I said to Ortega and not to the second voice. If the helos sit down tomorrow. Port captain's stretched, she said, a clack like a keyboard. Earliest tender can stand off at noon. I can prioritize Diesel A if you maintain control. Non-compliance will trigger a pause on resupply until we have a documented corrective. Clear? It was the kind of clear that means we will starve you of everything that isn't your problem. Clear, I said. I signed off before the second voice could find a polite way to say my name. Luis was in the doorway with his arms wrapped tight, not for warmth, but to keep from reaching for anything. "We blow the whistle," he said when the line died. "No static, just the neat sudden absence you get from expensive switches. We call the Coast Guard, we send the FLIR, we send everything." "On what?" I asked. "The sat line Ortega owns? The backhaul she monitors?" The neon buzzed overhead, steady and bored. A draft found the seam of the door and explored my ankles like a cat that doesn't want petting. "You heard the leverage. She'll put the diesel on a diet and leave us to journal our ethics." "Journal this," he said, furious in the quiet. He jerked his chin at the base set. The breaker was still open. The plug still lay on the floor like a pulled tooth. The speaker leaned inward again, ever so slightly, and let a child's rehearsal leak through. Posies. With the same off-key patience from part 4. The VU needle stayed nailed down. The room wanted to form ice inside the things designed to keep that from happening. "We don't answer," I said. "I'm not answering. I'm documenting. There's a difference." He swallowed and winced. Cold dries a swallow out where people can see. "We can't be the only site. There have to be papers. Papers mean change. Papers mean sponsors," I said. "Sponsors mean gatekeepers. Gatekeepers mean 30 more winters of this with better drawings." He stared at me like I'd hit him, and maybe I had. Good. Better me than what was outside. I went to the admin terminal to file the evacuation request into something that would look like accountability in 3 months. The desktop still had the previous caretaker's folders half scrubbed. In winter sat a subfolder named Retention. Inside, a calendar entry on repeat. 317, check windows. Beside it, a draft email open and unsent, timestamp sitting at 318, subject line human heat buffer, night guidance. The body was 2 sentences of corporate air, close guest wing loops, 0200 to 0400 to encourage redistribution. Staff to remain in technical spaces, observe and record. Avoid engagement, no signature, no recipients. A half-born memo waiting to slide toward the same people who deny it existed. The cursor blinked after avoid engagement. Patient, like someone had been interrupted by the very thing they were scheduling around. Luis read over my shoulder and swore without heat. "She's feeding it," he said. "Not just tolerating, scheduling. Or copying someone who did," I said, thinking of pencil notes in torn margins and handwriting that leaned the wrong way. The winter retention reminder at 317 felt less like a safety check and more like a bell rung for supper. The radio, not plugged into anything, let the chorus lift one perfect syllable. E. Not my surname, the initial drawn out like a string. It found the thin skin over my wrist under the towel's memory and pinched. I closed the draft without deleting it. "We log," I said. "We don't answer. We keep the heat where human bodies are. No more controlled anything." "And if Ortega cuts us?" "Then we make our own heat," I said, and the words scared me more than the knock ever had, because I knew what I meant, and I knew what it would cost to try. The neon buzzed. The door seam breathed. Somewhere in the steel, something flexed a soft boing, like a hull making a choice. My watch chirped 317 in a voice only I could hear. The platform answered with a long, patient boing through the hull, like it had been waiting for me to make up my mind. We took the last loop together, me with the rule pages flat against my chest, Luis with the FLIR powered on and tucked under his arm like contraband he meant to use anyway. Accommodation was colder by then. Ortega's reduced non-critical load had gutted the berths to a sensible misery. Air came out of the vents dry enough to bite the throat and do nothing for skin. My fingers felt fatter inside the gloves and less mine. Bays 1 through 5 behaved. 6 panes each, frost where frost belongs. The FLIR drew the same competent picture it always had. Warm lines where power lived, a fat honest orange at the water heater we refused to shut down. We said 6 out loud for each bay because saying it helps the math know you're counting straight. We came round to bay 6 and stopped 6 paces short without planning to. The seam wore its bead of weld like a mouth that didn't approve. The inspection windows, staggered, fixed circles of laminated glass, sat in their little brass bezels, like eyes that had never wanted a purpose beyond look. I counted once and got 6. I blinked and got 7. The 7th lived high, where light from the flare stack can make halos in good weather. It had no halo. It was just there, rimmed in the pale that isn't light. It fogged and cleared in the rhythm you see out of the corner of your eye when your own breathing is wrong. Then an eighth slid into place, low, to the right, where no glass had ever been cut. Not a mistake in the weld. A circle the size of the others, filmed from within, dull with attention. 6. 6, Luis said, like he was reminding himself how to count. He brought the FLIR up, thumbed brightness, swore softly. The camera showed the same cooled rectangle of a dead space, 6 round negatives at predictable stations, no more. 6, he said again, relieved. My mouth was dry. They're ajar, I said. I didn't mean the panes. 2 of the knot windows had a darker crescent at one edge, and a faint, continuous blue-white thinness pushed out through the rims. The wrong way. Like breath leaving an aquarium. Like the room underneath trying to fog the world. The colors sat between arc light and hospital light and owed both of them money. We edged closer because that's what you do when you are afraid of not seeing the thing you already see. A maintenance ticket fluttered from a zip tie on the hinge dog at knee height, salt stiff and laminated. Caution. Differential greater than 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Seal, fail, risk. Someone had underlined greater than 15 twice and written no partials in pencil. The graphite had bled in a wet season and dried into a gray bruise. Photo, Luis said. He left the FLIR running against his hip and shook the instant camera awake. The motor whined like it was clearing salt from its throat. He framed simple, door, seam, 4 windows in one strip, 4 in the other. The print backed out and he waved it because that's what people do even when it doesn't help. Behind the glass, 8 shapes resolved in the same breath, not faces. Not yet. Ovals of disagreement, the exact size of those panes. A faint corona hung on each like St. Elmo's that had forgotten how to choose a masthead. On the third oval from the left, something touched from inside. A smudge at first, then 5 little arcs, fingertip by fingertip, each rimmed in carbon dust that didn't have anywhere to fall. 6, Luis said for a third time, stubborn or praying. He lifted the print and held it 3 inches from his headlamp. The image came up in that half-chemical way, soft at the edges until the center decides to exist. When it did, the photograph had 8 tidy circles where the glass ought to be, 2 of them with crescent mouths like a door cracked for air. Okay, he said, voice too even. So film says 8, IR says 6, my eyes say 6, your eyes say 8. That's nice. That's clean, controlled anomaly. Back up, I said. He didn't. He leaned in 1 inch too far. The cold jumped through his glove and found a knuckle and made him hiss. They're not reflecting, he said. They're present. From inside the door came a sound we hadn't yet earned. Not a knock, not a scrape. The steel dog on the second hinge clicked as if a hand had nudged it from the warm side. A bolt you set with a bar will answer with a certain mass. This had that mass. And then a second bolt higher up answered to make the point, social. The pressure horn over the walkway hiccuped a half note at the same moment, like the platform's lungs had skipped. The deck did a short, eager tremor under our boots, the way steel shudders when a heavy thing begins to move where heavy things do not. Controlled opening, Luis said, already there. We could take it ourselves, 2 millimeters, observe response, receipt. No partials, I said, tapping the ticket. The ticket tapped back against the dog as if someone had breathed in behind it. My fingertips went numb with a little stinging ring out to the nails. He put his shoulder toward the dogging bar, not to move it, just to share heat with a decision. I grabbed his harness and hauled, hard enough to make the webbing creak. We run, I said. Now. The second hinge dog twitched again. Not imagination. The slot moved a hair. A child's palm printed full on the lowest pane from the inside. Perfect size, no whorl, just charcoal arranged like skin pretends it can be remembered. A second palm joined it. The blue corona around both brightened the way welding arc brightens when the rod bites correctly. The instant camera spit a second print on its own. The battery shouldn't have had 2 in it. The picture ghosted into 8 rounders, and for a split instant, every circle held an eye-shaped oval, black to the pupil, and rimmed with that wrong corona. They were not looking at us. They were angled past our shoulders at the warmed rectangle of corridor behind us, where the accommodations still pretended at heat. Now, I said again. We did not turn our backs until we were 3 paces down and had a corner to take. When we took it, the platform made a new sound, soft as breath and heavier than any wind. Metal remembering how to open from the side that never should. The gear locker smelled like wet canvas that had forgotten how to dry. Neon over the doorway hummed, that thin dentist's tone that makes your gums feel the shape of your teeth. We ducked in because steel and bolts were starting to talk back on the Bay 6 side. A room with masks and straps and rules on the wall felt like a place that could hold a line. Yellow suits hung in a row, stiff shoulders, the reflective chevrons gone gray with salt. One was missing its helmet. The empty throat ring looked too much like a mouth waiting for a spoon. "Shh, she's not a person," Luis said under his breath, like that was a spell. His voice came with no steam. The locker air had the kind of dry that pinches the back of your nose and makes you want to swallow just to hear something human. Something moved between two suits without pushing them. A gap sharpened. And a hand I could see only in the way the fabric responded smoothed the sleeve on the leftmost hanger. Slow, domestic. The chevrons on that arm brightened without a lamp touching them, each stripe lighting into its own opinion of white. The woman in the yellow stood there as if she had grown in from the paint, hazmat hood down, hair in a bun that had learned patience decades ago. Face clear the way things get when they no longer have to spend energy pretending to be warm. The reflective tape along her shoulders threw light of its own, not a lot, just enough to make her shadow go the wrong way, toward the glow, not from it. Her hand lifted. She pressed her palm to the polycarbonate window of the cabinet where spare gloves lived. Frost formed inside the pane, blooming from the print outward like a flower filmed in reverse. Furnace failed. She said to no one in us. The words broke where breath should organize them. Wind changed. Keep them together, I wrote. Her head turned as if she'd heard a radio at a distance. The neon buzz wavered and recovered. I said nothing, because talking to the woman in the yellow is rule number 4 in a new suit, and because rule number 7 was burning the inside of my jacket where the papers sat. My right wrist remembered 19 seconds too well and kept my hand inside the pocket like a child in a crosswalk. Luis set his camera down very gently and didn't switch it on. "Don't," he said, low. "Whatever you think this is, don't." Her eyes weren't right. Not wrong like horror illustrations. Wrong like glass you think is open until a bird finds it. There was a depth and no focus. She looked past me at the bench where our gloves had made wet rings, like that bench meant home in a language we didn't speak. "Mrs. Vargas," I said before my good sense could throw a hand over my mouth. Seeing the name on the fallen tag earlier had been enough to tell my tongue what to risk. "Elena." The reflective tape brightened a notch. Her mouth made a small movement toward yes. She didn't smile. "Little," she said. Her hand lifted a few inches off the cabinet so the frost could stop pretending it knew how to be water. "Each night, we keep them safe. We keep you." The SAT handset on my belt popped once, dry static like salt crystals shattering. No ring, no call, just a little sound that says we can hear you even when we don't speak. Ortega's name glowed on the tiny screen from the last call as if that counted for presence. Luis stepped into my space hard enough that our jackets gave a squeak. "No," he said to me, not to her. "This is where they bargain. You don't bargain with cold. You isolate it and starve it until spring." "Spring turns people into names on plaques," I said. The sentence came out flat enough to scare me. There are lines you only hear yourself cross when you step on them. Elena's hand, call it that for lack of a better term, drew a small circle on the cabinet fog. When she took it away, the frost pattern stayed like chalk. A loop. Heat share with the kind of engineer shorthand that looks like a child's drawing until it kills you. "Just a little," she said again. "Under rules. Yours if you like. No more knocking. No more windows." Her shadow still fell toward the tape. The cold in the room had organization now. The air moved, but not from door to vent like it's supposed to. It drifted lean-to toward her, like warmth knew which way to walk if it wanted a job. My palm went cold all by itself, even with the glove on, an ache that wasn't temperature, but subtraction. Outside, one of the low-pressure indicators in the passage winked twice as if someone had covered it with a hand and lifted that hand slow. The SAT handset popped again and showed a useless little icon, message draft saved, like an email had written itself somewhere. I didn't need to open it to know which subject line it would carry. "We decline," Luis said, and the way his teeth clicked on the end said he meant it harder than the sentence could carry. He set his hands where I could see them so I wouldn't have to imagine him reaching. Ethan? He'd never used my name like a rope before. It pulled. It also told the room which word to taste next. Elena's head turned an angle it didn't need, past me again toward the corridor, and then back. Her hood's edge brushed the hanging suit. Fabric made a sound I'm used to, polymer over polymer, and then kept making it after her hand was gone, like memory had friction now. Together, she said, breaking it into pieces that could be stacked. Warm, not hungry, you can choose. I watched the tape shine and the shadow lie and the frost sit on the wrong side of the glass. I thought about 19 seconds and the 7 fog ovals that had watched me count. I thought about the draft email blinking 3:18 like a door held for someone. I thought about Ortega's voice with a second mouth nested inside it saying, "Feed them like a grace before meat." Oh, shh. "You promised protection," I said, careful to keep my voice on the side of report. "No more knocks, no more children at the glass. You hold your own. Off the crew." Her head dipped, an old habit of agreement that didn't use muscles anymore. Luis shook once, a tiny shiver that wasn't temperature. "Don't," he said again. He wasn't talking to me anymore. He was talking to the part of me that counts budgets and calls it mercy. I didn't offer my hand. I didn't step closer. I let the silence do the work. Contracts do when nobody reads them out loud. The neon hummed. The tape shone. Frost on the cabinet held its bloom from the inside. Somewhere under our feet, Bay 6 flexed with the quiet satisfaction of steel that has started to remember which direction the dogs turn. Luis was gone when I came out of the locker. Neon still hummed. The suits didn't move. The corridor draft had changed direction again, a slow lean toward Bay 6 like a tide you only notice when the scum line crawls. I found him by the dogging bar, his shoulder set, his glove off, like a man about to negotiate by touch. The FLIR hung from a strap, running, its screen a polite lie, 6 black circles, dead space, everything normal if you let cameras decide the world. "Don't," I said, already close enough to feel the cold press through my jacket as a shape, not air. "I'm not opening," he said. "I'm talking." He brought his knuckles within an inch of the lowest pane, as if proximity could count as conversation without cost. "You understand me?" Controlled. Measured. Mattered. On the other side, a child's palm answered before he finished the sentence. Print to print, perfect match, size to size. Frost laid itself under his skin like a map traced too hard. The ring finger went slate first, then the little finger. A web of white rushed his wrist, following vessels like hasty handwriting. Luis hissed and snatched back, but the cold kept coming. Afterthought physics. Always late. "Back," I said, and pulled. He stumbled the way you do when your body's timing goes out. His right cheek blanched under his stubble in a clean oval and stayed that way. He touched it and missed his own face the first time. The pressure horn above us coughed and stayed lit, a fat red eye that meant wrong pressure and, more importantly, wrong priority. 30 yards off the port quarter, the flare stack fluttered, starved, and went out between one breath and the next. The absence hit like a name scratched off a door. With the red gone, the blue-white halo at the seam had nothing to argue with. It thickened and took the shape of light that did not know how to warm. Lights in accommodation dropped to 60%, like a single sigh had pulled the grid down. Green batteries winked under the breaker panels with the lazy blink of things that will not help for long. In the passage aft, someone said, "Jesus," not as a prayer, but as a diagnostic, because the moisture at the corner of his mouth had crystallized in a lace of crystals like sugar rim on a glass. We hear platforms in layers, thrusters, pumps, vents, the tick of relays. Familiar choir. Tonight the choir forgot its verses. Vents exhaled without turbulence. Footfalls sounded shorter. Fabric noises lingered half a beat too long, like memory had friction. "Plant," I said, because Ortega's voice lives in that word. "If they starve the flare, we don't have honest heat. We make our own." "The deck heaters aren't rated for. They're rated to keep hands moving," I said. "Hands are what we've got. Move." I dragged him down the catwalk, his right hand uncooperative, his fingers whitening like someone turning down a dimmer inside bone. He was counting under his breath, 6, 6, 6, and the third 6 came out wrong, like he'd bitten it. In the power bay, I shut 2 radiators to the birth loop and felt the heat leave with the tidy obedience only plumbing gives you. The needle on the loop temp fell, quick as a bad market. In the same motion, I opened the feed for the deck heater line and swung the isolation cocks. Metal gave that lovely deep thunk when something connected to something else with purpose. Diesel smelled honest suddenly, warm in potential only, heavy and animal. Across the corridor, a deckhand in a knit cap hugged his ribs and watched the lights sag to 50-40 and then stabilize. He said nothing, because sometimes you can only watch how a choice looks when it passes through a face. Blue-white leaked down the passage like a spill that had never been a liquid. The seam at Bay 6 brightened, and the top dog turned a quarter by itself, the bar juddering with the weight of a decision made from the warm side. The door didn't open. It didn't have to. The first of them came through where doors stopped mattering. It was a boy at first glance. No steam from the mouth. Hair that didn't move in draft. Boots not modern. He had the posture of a child told to wait, feet together, toes turned in. Behind him, 6 others in a neat half circle. And then Elena. Tape gleaming like a gauge needle catching light. They were more themselves than before, edges sharpened by what we'd already given them, in seconds and in looking. Their eyes had the corona we'd learned, blue halos like a tiny storm around each pupil. They did not look at us. They looked past us into the rooms where heat still pretended to live. Luis, I said, because names cut through more than knives. On me. Now. He tried to step, and his knee suggested an edit. He went down to a hand and missed the deck by 2 inches. The nervous system sometimes loses track of Z. For 3 seconds, he held nothing, hands spread on air like he expected a pain there. And then the platform remembered gravity for him, and he hit. He said, okay, which is what people say when it's not. They didn't rush. That was the worst of it. No lunging, no childish chaos. The 7 arranged themselves with domestic patience, each at a pane that hadn't been cut and yet was, each palm on the air for balance. Elena watched the heater manifolds like someone reading a recipe. The low-pressure lamps along the run winked in sequence, ahead of where they planned to go. I closed the second radiator to accommodation and watched breath become jewelry on the lips of a man between us and the stair. He scraped it off with a thumb and stared at it until it melted into a wet thumbprint on his glove. Why is it colder when the vents are on? He asked the air. Because we're not the ones using it, I said. I put my hand on the deck heater choke like it was a pulse to be found. The casing was room temperature, useless. The fuel line throbbed with the promise of burn if I would give it a spark and a reason. Out on the black water, something answered. Not the flame we know, but 7 low domes of white-blue lights standing off the port beam in a polite arc, mirroring the shapes at the door. They cast a winter onto our faces and drew nothing from the sea that we could see. The ocean took the reflection and did not return it. This is where you pick, Luis said, voice thin, numb cheek slurring the P. Save people or prove it.
Comment your thoughts
I'm
below,
done proving,
and
I
don't
said.
forget to subscribe.
I put my hand flat to cold steel
Dr.Noctis
to anchor the shake,
for more horror
and the steel
stories
felt like a mouth
from the
deciding.
dark.
We make heat. The wind came back when the flare died. Not a howl, just threads tugging at the catwalk, sea slapping the pontoons on a slow offbeat, like someone testing a door they'd assumed was locked. Off port, 7 cold domes held their neat circle and laid winter on the water without taking a ripple from it. On deck, the children arranged themselves like a bell had rung in a school I couldn't see. Elena watched the manifolds and didn't blink. Breath made crystals at the corner of his mouth. Pick, he said, voice narrow. Save them or prove it. Save them, I said, and stopped talking. Rule number 7 warmed against my ribs like a pocket heater. No partials. I clipped my harness into a pad-eye, so if I dropped, I'd drop in place. I thumbed the deck heater's choke to ready. It needed ignition. It needed a reason. You want warmth, I told them. No need to shout. Take mine. All at once. I bit the right glove off and shoved it under my jacket. Steel looked like surface and wasn't. I set palm and forearm flat to the plate where the heater housing met the deck. No edges, no mercy. And pressed until bone put a note in my head. I counted, because numbers are bridges when everything else floats away. 1, 5, 10. By 19, the skin over the radial hollow had shifted from ache to that glassy, false-safe quiet that means nerves have signed a waiver. The cold didn't blow. It drank, up veins, along tendons, through the braid of nerves toward the shoulder like someone drawing with a straw. My heart missed once, wrench on grating misfire. Breath shortened to little sips so the pain wouldn't notice. 30. Frost climbed my words. Blue coronas cinched around invisible hands beside mine. Tape on Elena's suit glared hard enough to ghost my good eye. Low-pressure lamps winked down the run like someone tapping a code. The platform gave a long boing I felt in bone before ear. Out beyond the handrail, the swell flattened for a second, as if the sea was also holding its breath. 40, 52. My left hand on the choke shivered and wouldn't stop. Vagal fog pressed in at the edges. The world tilted half a degree. 60, 70. Luis crouched where I could see him without turning. One hand on the pull start, the other tight on my harness. He waited, because timing is the difference between a scar and a coroner's note. At 80, the cold found my shoulder like a key. Sound moved to a higher floor. Names in my head went quiet. The part of me that keeps ledgers put down its pencil and said, now. 90. I dragged one more breath. Now. Luis pulled. Diesel coughed, caught, and roared in a register I felt in my teeth. The heater woke like an animal with work to do. Paint singed. Contacts bit. One hard blue tick of ozone, and then light happened in air itself. A red-orange river of convection poured off the casing, shimmering the deck behind it, a moving blade that could not be argued with. Shh. Heat does things cold never learns. It lifts, it bounces, it throws shadows the right way. The river crossed my forearm and split the blue. Coronas stretched, thinned, and tore. Off port, the 7 domes winked out together as if a single hand covered them. The seam on Bay 6 hiccuped and sulked. Frost on the nearby rail retreated upwind, the way water finds downhill when gravity remembers itself. Pain returned behind the heat and made promises for later. My heart took the hint and corrected. For a breath, the 7 looked like kids caught past curfew. Elena looked like someone who had learned regret after the need for breath was gone. Go, she shaped clean. The door dogs that had turned themselves eased back to proper angles without touch. The space that wasn't a door became a passage. Sash! They came out of the not space like people stepping off a bad elevator. Stumble, blink, inventory. A maintenance man in coveralls with a patch I didn't recognize. A woman with a social services badge who stared at her hands like she just remembered them. A priest touched his throat, found collar, found pulse, then fogged air, and laughed when he saw the fog. 14 more, all wearing that squint of a nap nobody scheduled. 17 in total. They crowded the heater like lizards, palms out, eyes watering, faces collapsing into living again. The 7 watched with expressions I don't own words for, and then started to come apart in the wind. Edges to mist, taped to the idea of a line, halos to nothing. Alina was last. She touched a cabinet that wasn't here, smoothed a sleeve that wasn't hanging, glanced at the heater like a stove you learned to trust the hard way. Help them remember, she said, and went where hunger and warmth don't mean anything. Afterdrop hit 3 minutes later like a polite wreck. My hands forgot plans. Knees did their own thing. Luis dragged me back against the heater, zipped my jacket over both of us, and patted heat into my sternum like he could talk my heart into obedience. He looked at the empty seam and at the people crying steam into the orange air. You burned them out, he said, voice raw. Not fed. Burned. By dawn, the med lockers were empty of blankets. Ortega called at 8:10 with a voice made of policy. Archive lost. Protocols stand. Likely gas hallucination. No spill, no loss of life. Shut in through Q2. NDAs on next flight. Copy, I said, because sometimes survival uses all the same words as surrender. They flew the 17 to shore under names they remembered or names we found. Some kept old lives, some started new ones. Luis filed nothing public and called it a draft he'd burn. I stayed until the last panel cooled, then took work that spends heat the right way. SAR boat, brown water to blue, radios that carry names that still belong to mouths. Offshore you hear children sometimes. Wind plays in lines. Waves make toys out of trash. I hear it and do not answer and keep working. But once in a while, rare as a flat sea, the sound isn't hungry. It's warm hands on a heater in bad weather, everyone counting until the numbers spell home. That's the sound I file. That's the rule I keep.